Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm delighted that we are bringing this program to you in partnership with our sister institution, the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. And in a minute, I will turn the program over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Khalil Jahsham, who's the Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Before I do so, I should remind our audiences that the Arabic translation is available for this program through the translation function of Zoom. If you go to Spanish, you'll be able to hear in Arabic. And Dr. Lindsey Stephenson, our featured distinguished speaker, has kindly agreed to take some questions at the end of her presentations. And I ask that you either present those questions directly through Zoom, through the chat function, or raise your hand in the Zoom function, or you can submit your questions in either Arabic or English through the Arab Center's social media channels. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Khalil Jahsham, Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Khalil?
Thank you, Mehran. It's a pleasure to be with you, partnering on this very important event entitled From Neighbors to Foreigners, Iranians in Bahrain in the early 20th century. And we are particularly delighted that Lindsey has taken time of her busy schedule and writing and what have you to be with us today. For those of you who do not know Dr. Stephenson, she is a postdoctoral research associate affiliated with the Department of Near Eastern Studies and the Center for Digital Humanities. She is at Princeton, and she is a social historian of the Middle East and Western Indian Ocean area. Her most recent work looks at social and cultural transformation in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. It depends on through which window you are looking at the region from your home. But at any rate, particularly in the early 20th century, her dissertation focused specifically on the migration of Iranians across the shores of the Gulf and the ways in which this phenomenon was shaped by state-building projects and global capital markets. She's currently working on a project with the Center of Digital Humanities to create a database of court records from the British Political Agents Court in Bahrain back between 1920 and 1950. And these records represent previously untapped source of social history in the Gulf, very important to scholars focusing on the region. But the nature of the British Empire's involvement in the region and the way in which various overlapping legal authorities manage their mundane legal matters. Lindsey's next project takes on the question of periodization of the Middle East, and specifically how the gradual experience of modernity in the Gulf region led to the reorientation of either shore away from the economic world of the Indian Ocean arena and inwards towards landed nationalist subjectivities. Lindsey has been very involved as a curator and co-producer of the Indian Ocean series podcast with Ajam Media Collective, which was established by graduate students worldwide in 2011, basically to challenge the simplistic representations by the media of the whole region, a concern that we share with her at Arab Center, whether in Doha or here in Washington. So we hope that our event today would shed some serious light on this region and its sub-ethnic or ethnic diversity to kind of bridge that gap that she's been working on for a long time. Lindsey, it's a pleasure having you. Thank you for joining us. The microphone is yours.
Thank you both so much for inviting me today to talk about Iranian migration in the Gulf. It's not a topic that people want to hear about very often, so I feel honored that you asked me to come. So as you mentioned, I am a historian. of the first half of the 20th century in the Gulf. And my first project was, that I have spent a number of years on now, was looking at migration from Iran to Kuwait and Bahrain in that period, the first 40 years, let's say, of the 20th century. So consider yourselves warned that I'm a historian, and I want to start off the talk today by contextualizing the presence of Iranians on what some people consider the Arab shores, the southern shores, the western shores. There are so many qualifications that we have to use when we're talking about this region because there are so many different perspectives on its history. So if I were to ask any of you what you know about Iranians in the Gulf, particularly the Western audiences, I'm sure would immediately think hundreds of thousands of Iranians in Dubai. But I want to stress, I'm not going to talk about those Iranians today, unless you force me later. But they're really only the most recent iteration of a much deeper history of migration throughout the region. And so I won't take you back to the very beginning of that story, but I do want to show how movement of Iranians in the early 20th century around the waters of the Gulf actually impacted the formation of a new political geography in the region and changed people's perceptions of who they were, where they were from, and the meaning of the spaces that they were moving around. So with that, I'm going to share my presentation with you. I hope you can all see this now. Okay, great. So this is probably the image that comes to mind when we think of the Gulf region today. A major waterway flanked on either side by very large regional powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, along with these smaller emirates on the southern or western shores, again, depending on your perspective. But I want to take a few minutes to sort of shake up our geographical understanding of the region, because although this is what comes to mind now when we think of the Gulf, it's not necessarily the historical region, both geopolitically, but also from the perspective of people who actually lived on those shores. So in our contemporary imagination, the waters of the Gulf are kind of a sideshow to the landed polity. I want you to look, just sort of take in this 10th century map of the Gulf. Now the label here is Bahr Faris, the Persian Sea, other iterations of the same map from around the same time, say Bahr Ajam. The important point is that in the 10th century, when this geographer is drawing the region, the water is massive, and it also includes spaces that we don't often think about when we sort of envision the Gulf today. So we have East Africa down here, Zanzibar or Zanzibar. Then the Gulf is up here, and India is over. There's depending on the orientation of the top part. And these three islands in the middle are Awal, which was the previous name of Bahrain, Kharg, which is an island off of the coast of Bushehr that basically no one has heard of these days, and then Luft, which is an Iranian island closer to like Qish. So this is a kind of historical perspective on the region from somebody who's coming from outside. But if you notice, this map isn't really interested in the different polities around the region and sort of drawing lines around spaces. It's really about the port cities. The port cities are what are noted in this map. And so, the world of the Persian Gulf is really just a bunch of port cities connecting to one another in a region that we would probably now call the Western Indian Ocean, more than we would think of as like the limited Persian Gulf. But this was the world of the Persian Gulf. And it's was very inseparable from these other kinds of spaces leading up to the modern period. So these ports represent kind of trade routes, or maybe an economic perspective. Economic imperatives were much more relevant to the people in this space than were, political geographies. I'm going to switch to a map that feels more familiar and comfortable to everyone. Try not to throw you off too much. So this is a map of basically the same space. And in this kind of Indian Ocean arena, which the Gulf is a part of, you have this phenomenon over time of shifting cities. So I've circled, I put some areas here in red where we have cities sort of rising and falling over time in the face of political or environmental or economic catastrophes. People just move down the shores or across the shores. And so the maps, the cities that are noted on maps change over time, but in general, they stay in these general areas. And so this is sort of the background context, the world of the Gulf in the pre-modern period. And now I want to zoom in on one of these red circles to talk about movement of towns and migration in the 20th century. So this is the area that we're going to talk about today. And this is a really beautiful map made by Michael Izadi, which sort of delineates what he's showing as the cultural historical domain of the Gulf. So the point of this with these borders, the border here doesn't represent any political border. He's trying to show a kind of cultural zone. And this is the zone within which people are operating. People's lives are primarily oriented towards the water. So people, across and along the shores have much more in common with each other than they do with people further into the interior. That's not to say that these spaces are completely disconnected to the interior. They're, the interior of the Arabian Peninsula and Iran is very much a part of people's lives, but not to the same extent as people in spaces across the waters. So the networks that flowed through this space look more like this. So people are generally connected to the directly opposite shores of the Gulf. So for example, traveling back and forth happens with the smallest distance and not all the way directly up and down across the Gulf. So what happens is you find, to use the example of Dubai again, the people who are in Dubai were mostly coming from the shores directly opposite of that, and not from the further north, like Bushehr or Mohammed or something like that. So these four webs that I kind of researched and put together are tentative, but I think it's a pretty good general way of showing how people move from the Iranian side to the Arab shores of the Gulf. We'll just call them that for now. And it's important to recognize these webs because people across the South of Iran come from very different cultural, religious, and even linguistic backgrounds. So these webs are actually very meaningful when we try to understand what actually is getting transferred when people move to the opposite shores. So to take a really glaring example, the wind towers that we see in Dubai, everyone knows that the Iranian migrants built them. Well, Iranians also migrated to Kuwait, so why don't we have wind towers in Kuwait? Well, if you understand these webs, then you know, because the people from this Bandar Linge Bestek area had wind towers, and they brought them across to Dubai. But the people who moved to Kuwait, there weren't wind towers in that area of Iran. So hence there, not much historical evidence of wind towers in Kuwait. So this is just one example amongst many of why it's really important to understand the diversity of the populations all across the southern shores of Iran. Okay, so let's move to, this is kind of our historical background, and I want to move now to the 20th century. The 20th century really challenged this kind of fluidity and migration and the ease of relationships of people moving back and forth across the Gulf. In the end of the 19th century, these webs that I've shown here were webs of trade and interaction. But in the 20th century, a number of things happened that turned these webs of interaction into routes of migration on a much larger scale, not on the scale of a few merchants moving back and forth, but actually significant numbers of people moving to the other side. And when they do so primarily within these same webs that I've shown here. So in the early years of the 20th century, tens of thousands of Iranians moved from the south to the opposite shores in the first half of the 20th century alone. And this migration is really set off by new import and export taxes put in place by the Iranian central government in the last years of the 19th century. And these taxes were both an attempt to sort of reaffirm the integrity of the Iranian state. To be able to tax your periphery is, a way of showing that you have control over the territory. So this is one of the goals. And the second goal is to extract revenue from this very wealthy periphery. Bandar Linga and Bushehr at that time, in the end of the 19th and early 20th century, really the economic centers of the Gulf. Linga was the center of the very lucrative pearling trade that I'm sure everyone who has been involved with the Gulf has heard about. And so Tehran really tries to assert itself by taxing those areas. But what they didn't understand with the central government is how easily people were able to move along and across the shore. So what happens is, they put in these sort of extreme taxes, and the merchants say, okay, well, we'll just go to the other side because that's what people have been doing for centuries. The other side was familiar to them. It didn't really matter to them whether or not they were in Linga or Bahrain. So what happens is, all of merchants start to move, and other affiliated people start to move, and they bring workers along with them. And the first destination really is Bahrain, and it becomes sort of a replacement for Bandar Linga, just as we saw in the broader Indian Ocean context with these shifting cities. Again, we have them just shifting to the other side. And I haven't come across any record of the Sheikh of Bahrain being upset about this or caring at all. I mean, I think probably as long as it was bringing him revenue, he didn't mind. And there's plenty of evidence of Iranians, people who have moved from the south of Iran, working on behalf of the Sheikh of Bahrain. But the numbers start to really go up. It's turning into thousands of people moving, not one village, not some labor start to move, and tensions run quite high. In addition to this very new population showing up, we also have increased British involvement in the region. And this is a map with stars of places where there were British protection treaties, the smaller stars. And so the local populations, the economic situation is changing as well. And so what happens is, in 1904, there's an outbreak of fighting, and the British call it anti-Persian rioting in the markets in Manama. And so this is really the first point where we see a kind of local reaction against the migrants. And so what happens is, it becomes a really critical moment in this sort of longer trajectory of Iranian migration, because the British, as they do, take it upon themselves to sort of sort things out. And they're the ones who sort of, they have this specific idea of how to pursue justice and, make people pay for what they did. And the Iranians are also trying to insert themselves in the situation in the central government, but they're really overstretched because a lot is going on in the north of the country at this time. And so according to the British, I haven't found documentation for this in the Iranian archives, but the British say that the Iranians, the central government, requests that the British sort of represent them in getting justice for their people or their subjects. It's probably, the Iranians probably meant for it to be a kind of temporary solution, and they didn't mean to fully cede jurisdiction to the British. But what happens is, because they're not sovereign and they aren't able to exercise their own jurisdiction, it's a way of trying to solve the problem without creating a new precedent. So, for example, they couldn't claim extraterritorial jurisdiction, because then that would be like saying that they don't claim Bahrain and they want to do something to protect their people inside of another territory. So what happens is they say, British, take care of it while we can't be there, and then we'll come back and revisit this situation later. And I guess they probably thought that giving this to the British, this responsibility to the British was better than giving it to the Sheikh, because they're trying not to recognize that he has authority on the island. So while the British had been intervening on the behalf of foreign subjects or foreign merchants for several decades, they had mostly been either European or subjects of British India. And so the case of the Iranians really set a new precedent, which the British would continue to refer to for several decades, to kind of keep the Iranian government out of the affairs of Bahrain and kind of tell them, we're handling the situation. And for me, it seemed really strange that the Iranians would make such a request. But if we think about it historically, it might not seem like so strange, because over the centuries, the territories on the borderlands of the Gulf existed in this sort of overlapping space. These two circles that I put here, which I haven't labeled, the purple one represents Iranian claims, and the black one represents Ottoman claims. And so the spaces that both of these empires claimed were overlapping. And it didn't really end up being a problem. Sometimes the Iranians would have more authority, sometimes the Ottomans would have more authority, and there was a kind of back and forth. So the fact that the Iranians asked the British to take care of things for a little bit probably reflects their sense that Bahrain will be in our hands again at some point soon. This is kind of the imperial vision of the situation, and they didn't really expect. I assume that they weren't really anticipating what was going to be the parameters of the modern state, and the authority that they were ceding to the British would never actually come back to them. So on the basis of this, the breakout of clashes against Iranians and Europeans in 1904, the British assumed jurisdiction over the foreigners. This was made official in 1909 when they finally coerced the Sheikh of Bahrain to agree to this. They spent 5 years trying to convince him that the Iranians were actually foreigners. He didn't see them in those terms. He kept referring them to the Iranians as his ra'iyah, his flock, his subjects. And the British were using Bahraini versus non-Bahraini terminology. And that just wasn't the way that he saw the world. So, finally he has to agree to it because he has no other choice. But he didn't, he had a kind of old view of the space and didn't see the Iranians as outsiders at all. Turning the Iranians of Bahrain into foreigners in need of British protection was kind of the first step in infusing a new official and legal understanding of belonging that was bound up with territorialization in the Gulf. I talked about the different treaties, and this is part of the British sort of seeping in and defining space in new ways. The British do end up protecting the Iranians. They set up an entire court for dealing with their affairs. They influence patronage networks. But even deeper than all of this is this question of jurisdiction and how that brought about a kind of new spatial awareness in the region and forced upon people territorialized identities rather than previous identities were formed based on who your family is and not necessarily where you're from. So these transformations weren't limited to British actions in Bahrain. The Iranian central government also played a role in sort of cementing its subjects' ideas of who they were and where they belonged. Basically turned into a paper war between the British in Bahrain and the Iranians. And what happens is, in order to infuse people and spaces with identities, they start issuing all kinds of different traveling passes. So this is just like a sample of different passes that were used in the Gulf that people had to have when they were crossing. And what's really interesting is that different passes were used at different times. Sometimes some were, recognized, sometimes they weren't, sometimes they would stop being recognized and then again be recognized later. And they were all given to Iranians crossing on different bases. So some of them would state where the person was from, like where they were born. Some people would just state the destination. Some people would actually, some of the passes actually claimed the nationality for these people. But this is sort of is really starting to shape how people think about themselves and where they're going. And really these passes caused a lot of difficulty for the Iranians who continued to go back and forth across the Gulf, particularly the merchants. People who were on small boats would find ways to figure out how to get around customs administrations. But for merchants who were carrying with them cargo, they had to pass through these larger ports where there are people waiting to, check their documentation. And so it became, honestly, a really big headache for them. But at the same time, they still very much felt, a lot of them still very much felt Iranian, especially for those who had moved in their lifetime. And so I just wanted to give you an example of what that looks like on paper, or how I, come up with these kind of conclusions. This document is the will of one of the Iranians. It wasn't a big merchant. He had some money, but not much. He passed away in 1929. And what his will says, I think really nicely demonstrates both the connectedness of the Iranians to both shores and the kind of difficulties they had navigating and explaining that that continued sort of dual identity. So in this will, it says a lot of things, but one of the things that I want to point out is that he takes all of his money in Toman, which is like Iranian currency, and he divides it into 3 parts. The first part is for someone to pray and fast on his behalf. The second part is to go to repair a mosque in Iran, in his native town of Jahrom. And the third part is for the Ajam Husseiniya in Bahrain. So, and then he, appoints specific people who will go and take the money, and how will they get there, and all of these things continue in the record. But I think it's a really beautiful illustration of the kind of the dual identities, the dual belongings of the Iranians in this period, further complicated by all of these paperwork wars that I've been talking about. So I'm going to stop sharing now and bring you back to me. I want to end by talking just a few minutes about sort of the end of this chapter in the very long history of Iranian migration to the southern or western shores of the Gulf. In 1937, I mentioned that the 20s and 30s are the paperwork wars, difficulties traveling and moving around. In 1937, Bahrain issues this nationality and property law, which basically says that foreigners aren't allowed to hold property. So if you're going to have property, you're going to have to be Bahraini. And this was a really, really strict law, especially considering that the Iranians in Bahrain were a very large share of the landholders there, and they were a very wealthy community. And so they had to make a decision whether or not they wanted to maintain Iran and the Iranian nationality or identity, or if they wanted to keep their wealth and become Bahraini. And so a lot of people did end up, it wasn't just the Bahrainis who were forcing people to make these kinds of decisions. The Iranian government it was kind of a response to the Iranian government using the large numbers of Iranians in Bahrain as an excuse to, or as a part of their claim to the island. They said, look, Bahrain's obviously ours. See how many of our people are there? So the Bahraini government is really trying to counteract that by, nationalizing the Iranians there. I mean, people question why I use nationalizing people, because usually we hear about nationalizing oil, but really I feel, they're trying to bring them in, and give them nationality, give them passports. And so the only way for these Iranians who, in many cases, have been there for generations to remain local and acquire this local belonging in the space is for them to become Bahrainis. And of course, as we know, not all of the Iranians in Bahrain or in other countries of the Gulf were able to, become citizens and just disappear into the national fabric. Over the 20th century, despite further regulation of movement, the shores have actually become even closer together. That's sort of counterintuitive. Various waves of migration from those, that I'm talking about in the early 20th century continued during the time of the Shah, and those, those migrations forged deeper linkages into the interior, and are in many ways connected to the later migrations of the 20th century that produced these massive populations of Iranians in Dubai, for example. So now there are more Iranians on the shores of the Gulf than there have ever been at any other point in history. But at the same time, the meaning of what it is to be Iranian or Ajam has expanded significantly beyond the regions adjacent to the Gulf that we saw in the pre-modern